So last time we were talking about the upper respiratory rather, and now we're ready to shift to lower respiratory. Okay. 1 second. So the lower respiratory starts at the trachea and then moves down from there. So basically you've got essentially what looks like an upside down tree in your bronchial system. And that kind of moves into the lungs themselves. So the trachea, which is your windpipe, is basically going to be right adjacent to your esophagus, which is, I guess, use the same terminology, your food pipe. And so this is kind of the confluence of where your larynx is. So your larynx is basically right at the doorstep of your trachea. And then from your larynx, as it goes over your vocal cords, it moves into your primary bronchi. So your esophagus will go down and it'll split. It'll enter into your thoracic cavity. And then it'll basically split into right and left bronchi, your primary bronchi. Now, around your trachea are going to be not completely concentric, but kind of like C-shaped pieces of cartilage on the front side. It's kind of not unlike what Roman armor sort of was. Roman armor was notorious for having only half armor, so they had a breastplate, but they didn't have any back protection. The idea being that you should never run away from the enemy, right? So you should never have need for armor in the back, the idea is, because you're always going to advance. And if the enemy overtakes you, the last thing you do is run. You die in battle valiantly. That's the idea, right? So you only had like the front half, and then the back half was exposed, typically. And so this is kind of what the trachea is like. So it's basically got that sort of front end of your esophagus, trachea covered with your tracheal cartilage, and then behind the trachea, it's going to be open. But the behind part of the trachea is deep inside your neck. So it's already protected. So it doesn't need that kind of protection. This also creates a soft spot. So as the food bolus goes, because your esophagus is actually right behind your trachea, I can't draw it, otherwise I would, right? So it's kind of like two different tubes, and the esophagus is right behind the trachea. And so as the food bolus goes behind the esophagus flexes and expands. And so that kind of gives the ability some soft area for it to expand into. Otherwise, it would feel like something's getting stuck in your throat all the time every time you swallow, because it would run into that tracheal cartilage. That wouldn't be very pleasant. But this is kind of what it looks like. So the tracheal liner, or the tracheal epithelium, we've already talked about it a little bit, because these guys are those pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, right? Those ones that kind of look like they're stratified columnar because they got what looks like to them 2 rows of cells, but not really 2 rows. Why? Because a lot of these cells are actually connected in a simple format. That is to say that they have a basal connection point and then they have an apical connection point. So both in the same cell type. And no, but the important thing is these guys are busy making big globules of mucus, and they're secreting it into the open liner of your trachea. And then, of course, on top of these are cilia, which are little hair-like fibers that basically kind of wave back and forth. And as they wave back and forth, they're basically moving all this mucus typically out of your tract. So actually, they kind of whip-like fashion. So they kind of do a full wave up your trachea, and then they kind of bend down, and then they sort of go like this, and then they kind of do a full wave like this. So they're kind of like moving more in one direction. So the overall direction is in one direction. And the idea here is to catch little particles in that sticky mucus that you have in your epithelium, and then the cilia will sweep it up into your cough zone for you to cough it out. And so this is what's happening whenever you clear your throat or whenever you cough to clear your throat, is you're clearing out that tracheal mucus. Isn't that lovely? Right. What we refer to colloquially as phlegm. Right. So that's kind of what we have. So these pseudostratified ciliated columnar cells are important because this is basically how you're going to keep your air clean. Now, remember, we already talked about this already once. Remember, when we talked about taking air into the nasal cavity. A couple of jobs of the nasal cavity is to, first of all, screen for contaminants, right? So that's the reason why you have lots of mucus in there, is to catch all the contaminants that are coming in. But a couple of things, you'll warm the air, right, with all the vasculature, all those capillaries that are inside your nasal epithelium. But also, the idea is you trap a lot of foreign contaminants and particles, dirt particles, dust particles, things like that, so that what goes into your lungs is as clean as possible. I think we talked a little bit about kind of making, cement in your lungs if you're breathing in the right types of ash. For instance, we talk about volcanic ash and essentially creating cement in your lungs. And so that's what you don't want to do. So the idea is you have multiple stops along your way to basically clean up the air so that's as clean as possible. Now, if you're a smoker, then you're constantly assaulting your cilia, and your epithelium is constantly making mucus because it thinks it's like living in a forest fire, right? So it's constantly making mucus to catch all those smoke particles, and it never goes away. So the cells keep making that mucus, and that's the reason why smokers have that really crackly smoker's cough that doesn't go away, is because they're constantly assaulting their respiratory epithelium with smoke. And eventually, over time, you can damage your cilia with the smoke. The stuff that's in smoke is incredible. It's some pretty nasty stuff. Probably one of the nastier things, and the harshest things you can do for your body. So, a tracheostomy is basically a breathing tube. So this is essentially when you puncture a hole in the tracheal cartilage just below the Adam's apple, and you stick a straw in there, right? So that's helpful if somebody's got a blockage in the upper portion of the trachea, and so sometimes that'll help to kind of bypass that particular obstruction. And so that's kind of like emergency medicine. That's generally not, it's not a pleasant thing to do. It's definitely not for the squeamish, that's for sure, because obviously that tracheal cartilage has a little bit of resistance to it, and then when you break into it, it's got a little bit of a pop to it that is a little unsettling at times, but it's actually quite effective. If you get the hole big enough, you can stick a straw in there and people can actually breathe, and it's actually in some cases of like severe choking, people's lives have been saved with that. But typically, like I said, that's something that probably I wouldn't expect the average CPR certified person to be able to do. That's kind of more of like either a wilderness medic or like an off-duty EMT or something like that could do that, really quickly, like at McDonald's or something like that. Just listen, give me a straw, and I've got a knife. We're gonna just go for it, and this guy's gonna breathe. So it's not the sort of thing that just Joe Average necessarily knows how to do, right? No, Joe Average is working on Heimlich maneuver, right? That's acceptable for Joe Average. So the bronchial tree, then, as we start to move beyond the primary bronchi, it's going to be starting to move into right and left lung. And the first thing that happens is you move into the primary. So basically, you have your trachea coming down, and it's going to split into your primary bronchi, and then from there, that's entering into the lungs themselves. Now, as they go into the lungs, they move into what's called the secondary bronchi. So the primary bronchi will branch into the secondary bronchi, which will go into the tertiary bronchi, and then ultimately that'll branch into the bronchioles, right, which are the smallest of all of these respiratory vessels at a millimeter in diameter, which is about 1/10 of a centimeter. And so these guys also have cartilage around them, just like the trachea. But as it gets smaller, that cartilage disappears because you don't need that cartilage anymore. Because, for instance, once you actually move from primary to secondary, then what's going to happen is those secondaries are going to be inside the lungs. They're going to be protected by the rib cage and by the thoracic cavity and by the pleural cavity. And so they're not going to be as exposed, say, for instance, as the trachea. The trachea is just sitting right here in front row center for anything that hits you right there in front of your body. So it's really exposed, which is the reason why it has that little kind of cartilaginous armor on it. But once it actually enters into your thoracic cavity, it doesn't really need it anymore. It does carry it forward. It does go into the thoracic cavity, but once it actually enters the thoracic cavity, it's less necessary because you got your sternum to protect it and you got your rib cage to protect it. And so you got protection from other places. So what happens during things like an asthma attack? So in an asthma attack, what you have is basically smooth muscle that's wrapped around the bronchioles. And this smooth muscle contracts. And so that cinches down on the bronchioles, which cuts off your breathing. And that's what creates the wheezing effect. And generally speaking, this is usually induced by something that's not really all that harmful. Right? It's usually an allergic response, or something of that nature. Not always. Obviously, asthma comes on for different reasons. But generally speaking, it happens at times that aren't life-threatening in general. You don't need to close your airways down. That's almost never a good idea. It doesn't really matter what kind of life-threatening event is happening. Shutting off your air is almost never a good idea. So that constriction of the bronchioles is generally not a good situation. So where do the bronchioles go? So the bronchioles will basically go to these enclosures that are little sacs of air. And these guys are called the alveoli. So the alveoli are actually the important piece of the actual lungs themselves. Here's the structure where you can see the bronchiole basically coming down from this sort of subdividing sort of inverted tree system, bringing the air to these sort of blind alley pockets. So they're almost like cul-de-sacs, if you will, in a neighborhood where basically you have a cluster, like a little grape-like cluster of little itty-bitty air sacs. And each one of these little air sacs, these guys here, is an alveolus. And the alveolus is important because this is basically where your gas exchange is occurring. So when you're talking about oxygen exchange and CO2 exchange, it's at the alveolus that's happening. It's not in the bronchiole. It's at the alveolus. And the reason why we know that is because you can see here the vasculature, all these capillaries that are wrapped around each of these alveoli. So it's a lot. It's not just a little bit of vasculature. It's a ton of vasculature. So your lungs are enormously vascular because this is basically where your blood supply is picking up its necessary product. And so you maximize as much surface area as you possibly can. That's the reason why these guys are broken up into these clusters, is to increase surface area. So when you take a look at the lungs proper, these are basically your inflatable airbags. You have your secondary bronchi, which is essentially moving to different portions of your lung that then subdivide into tertiaries, and then subdivide into bronchioles, and then those finally terminate into alveoli. In the right lung, you have 3 different lobes. In the left lung, you have 2. And the reason why you only have 2 in the left lung is because a piece of it is carved out of the way to make room for the heart. So the heart is kind of nestled, leaning left. And that's kind of the reason why you only have 2. Otherwise, you'd have another lobe there. And the only problem with that is you would have no heart. And so heart is a pretty important idea. So it has to make room for that. Now, each of the lobes themselves are subdivided into lobules. And so these get kind of smaller and smaller in terms of their subdivisions. And then each lung is enclosed by the pleura. So your pleural cavity contains the lungs, and the pleura, which is the liners of your lungs and your cavities, is essentially the layers of the serous membrane that overlies that. And then, of course, in between these 2 layers is going to be your serous fluid. Okay, so when you take a look at that pleural fluid, so typically what happens is you're going to have your lung proper. So here's my lung. Now on top of my lung, I'm going to have my visceral pleura, where the visceral piece is going to be what's called, that's the innermost layer, right? That's the innermost layer that's laying right on top of the organ. And then after that, you're going to have your pleural cavity. And then on top of that, you're going to have, let's see, what ND, what color? Let's go green, obnoxious green. And then on top of that, you're going to have your parietal pleura. And that's going to be smack up against the parietal cavity, right? So the inside cavity wall. And so that's basically how these are working. And so when you take a look at this, then that pleural fluid is going to have a surface tension to it. Basically means a stickiness, if you will. And that's going to adhere to both the parietal and the visceral pleura. And so that surface tension is due to the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules, right? So basically water kind of has a slightly negative charge on oxygen, slightly positive on hydrogen. So when that hydrogen sees another oxygen from water, then it's going to zipper up to that negative. That creates a hydrogen bond. So it's like an electrostatic attraction between two water molecules. It's like Velcro, right? Think of the hairs and the hooks of Velcro. That's exactly what these water molecules are like. The positive and negative charges associated with these water molecules zippers these water molecules up like Velcro, and that creates a certain stickiness for water to cling to itself, and that's surface tension. So that surface tension then is important because it hangs on to stuff. It kind of creates a little bit of a grab, if you will, in this particular area. So for instance, when you expand your thoracic cavity, like for instance, when you breathe in, the parietal pleura, that outside portion, will pull, notice in quotes, the visceral pleura and the lungs outward. So this increases the size. Now here's what happens, right? So imagine my right hand is the parietal pleura, and the left hand is the visceral pleura, and in between is the interpleural fluid, which has a lot of surface tension to it. So what happens is when your lungs expand, the parietal, the wall of the pleural cavity, expands outward because the diaphragm is pulling the cavity open. And so what happens is because of that surface tension, as it pulls on the liquid or the fluid that's in that cavity, that liquid will go with the parietal movement. And then because it's attached to the visceral side, it'll start to pull that visceral portion and the lung that it's attached to also open. So basically, you never actually touch the lung tissue itself when you expand it. The way that you do it is kind of with this sort of surface tension grabbiness associated with the fluid and also with the pressure, right? Just kind of like the same way if you create like a vacuum or a suction, you can get things to move, right? By creating like a negative pressure. And that's what's happening here. So what happens is the parietal opens up, and that causes this kind of suction to occur, which pulls open the lungs. And that's going by way of that pleural cavity fluid, that pleural fluid in the cavity. So that's basically how you expand your lungs, or how you get your lungs to move. It increases the size of your lungs. Now, if you have something like pleurisy basically is an inflammation of these pleural lines. And oftentimes you can create a lot of water in the lungs, a lot of excess pressure, which would be quite painful. Okay, now let's go ahead and take a look at the alveoli. The alveoli are important because basically these guys are the physiological hotspots, what I call the physiological bullseye of the respiratory system. So everything up to this point, we've built into the system for this moment, right? So everything, whether we're talking about upper respiratory or lower respiratory, trachea, going to primary, secondary, tertiary, into bronchioles, Everything is leading to this particular moment. Because up to now, we've done absolutely nothing when it comes to anything useful with oxygen. All we've done is move air from point A to point B. That's all we've done. But we actually haven't done anything that our body needs. For the first time, once we actually get air into the alveoli, we can actually capture what we actually need. This is where your gas exchange is occurring. So when you take a look at your lungs in general, you're talking about several 100 million alveoli. Of course, that ranges. Ultimately, each of these alveoli are covered heavily with blood capillaries. You saw that in the previous image. Why? Because you're doing a lot of gas exchange. Now, because you're doing gas exchange, all this gas exchange is basically done by way of diffusion. And diffusion is distance limited. What does that mean? That means if you're going to do business by diffusion, it only works across short distances, right? So you can't do diffusion and expect this to travel to the other side of campus, right? I always like to use the example of the open bottle of perfume. Like if I'm holding an open bottle of perfume, then those of you guys who are in the room will be able to smell it because you're close. The distance for diffusion of the perfume to go from high to low, which is over there, is relatively small. But if I had you guys head all the way over to Auraria West, then all of a sudden those distances are considerably larger. And so you're not going to ever smell the perfume, right? And so that's an important limitation to always understand about diffusion. Now, the reason why I mention that is because having an understanding of the fact that diffusion is distance limited then leads us to the structure of the alveoli that is consequent because of that. So for instance, the walls are made of very thin structures. For instance, the simple squamous epithelium of a capillary and the simple squamous epithelium of the alveoli. You're about as thin as you could possibly get. So when you're looking at what we refer to as the respiratory membrane, then you're talking about the thinnest layer that you could possibly get for diffusion to work against or work across. Okay? And that's important because if you compromise that distance, even just a little bit, then you're going to compromise your ability to actually capture oxygen. Right? This is one of the reasons why, I think we have a slide for this one coming up here. It's one of the reasons why pneumonia is such a problem, because what happens with pneumonia is you start to collect fluid in your alveoli, and that starts to thicken up the distance that oxygen has to travel across to get into your blood. And it makes it harder and harder and harder for that oxygen to get in there. Okay. So oxygen will go across the alveolar walls and then enters into the bloodstream by crossing the bloodstream capillary walls. That's what it looks like. They're both simple squamous. So here's my simple squamous. Remember, minimal structure is a line of cells, simple, here's my simple squamous, that is tethered to a basement membrane. That's about as minimal as I can get. Right? So here's my basement membrane, and here's my line of cells. So this would be, let's say this is the alveolus. Then we're going to combine that with the simple squamous cells of the capillary with a basement membrane. This is as thin as it can get. This is as short as we can make our distance. Okay. So because it's short, then we're going to be able to get carbon dioxide to move across that membrane. So it's going to basically go from high concentration to low concentration, follow its diffusional gradient. and it'll go basically from the blood into the lungs for you to exhale out. Now, one thing that alveoli are lined with, so this is like your respiratory membrane. Put that under there. So this is what oxygen and CO2 are crossing over, is this very, very thin membrane. Now, on the inner lining or the inner wall of the alveoli, you're going to find a fluid called surfactant. This is basically a thin film of lipoprotein. And so the lipoprotein, its job is to lower the surface tension of water. Basically, it doesn't just prevent the alveoli from closing, but from sticking shut. That's actually a better way to describe it. Think about it this way. If you have a balloon, right, that you're blowing up, it's dry on the inside, you blow it up, it'll expand, yes? And if you let the air out, it'll also deflate, yes? If you kind of crumple it up, you'll still be able to blow it up, yes? Why? Because the rubber on the inside is still dry, and it didn't really stick to itself, so it's able to pop open pretty easily. However, if you get the inside of that balloon wet, can you blow it up as easily? If it deflates all the way and it's wet on the inside, what's going to happen to the balloon? It sticks together, right? That's because of the surface tension of water. So when you breathe out, if the alveoli were not coated, what would happen is the liquidy, watery portion of the inside of the alveoli would stick together like glue, and the surface tension of water would hold your alveoli closed. It would be like trying to blow up a deflated balloon that's stuck together with water on the inside. Now, could you do it? Yeah, probably, but it would take an awful lot more work to do it, right? And so that's what surfactant does. Surfactant basically is this lipidy type of secretion that coats the inner surface, and it keeps the balloon from sticking together when it deflates. That way, you can easily just pop it right back open with your next breath without having to fight for it. Okay, so one of the respiratory distress syndromes that you see in infants is a situation where they don't make enough surfactant. And when they don't make enough surfactant, the alveoli collapse, they stick together, and then they struggle to breathe. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a look then at the mechanism of breathing, ventilation basically. There's two phases: inspiration, which is a fancy way of saying inhalation. So if you want to impress your friends with that one, go ahead and lay that one on them. Or expiration, which is exhalation. Now, don't lay that one on your friends because they'll think you're talking about them dying. This is basically moving air out of the lungs. So, however, before we get to actually the mechanism of inspiration and exhalation, we need to understand a couple of things first of all. Now, kind of the lay of the land, so to speak. First of all, when you're breathing in a column of air. And so that column of air starts in your mouth and your nasal cavities, goes through your pharynx, it's in your trachea, it's in your primary and secondary bronchi, all the way down to your bronchioles, and then into your alveoli. So you have a continuous column of air that's inside your body. That's the important thing. But the only one that is really valuable to us is the air that gets to our alveoli. Okay, the rest of it doesn't do anything for us at all. Okay, so that's the first thing, to kind of understand that you have an entire column of air inside you, which is important because then when you talk about pressure and different pressure changes, usually I'm thinking of people like divers, for instance, who go through different pressure dynamics and things like that as they dive. Remember, you're not just working on pressure that's in your lungs, you're also working on pressure that's in your entire body. Okay, so your pressure is affected globally. Now, inside your thoracic cavity, you'll have a couple of different muscles that we want to take a look at that are going to be important in this process. First of all, you've got your thoracic cavity. Of course, you've got your rib cage. And so the tops and the sides basically of your thoracic cavity. So the opening to your thoracic cavity is essentially where your neck goes into. So if you were to like cut off your neck, basically your rib cage would kind of form like a little open hole that would go into the inside portion of your rib cage. Okay. This actually, if you, well, I guess it is getting to be close to Halloween. I do tend to get a little dark. I think I warned you guys about that once before. But one of the strategies of Romans, who were incredibly brutal and quite effective in their killing techniques, and they're also an interesting too, because this was actually not the only, but one of the important landmarks in history, in the history of anatomy and physiology, where we started to learn a lot about the body, the human body, like with Galen, for instance, who was a surgeon. One of the first surgeons that we think of, he actually did surgery on gladiators. So think of Galen as sort of like the team doctor. And so from Galen's work, we were able to learn a lot about anatomy and physiology. And so we kind of, at this particular period of time, the Romans sort of killed people for sports, but at the same time, they also made these very interesting intellectual and technological advances at the same time. They were a very complex group of people, which makes them interesting and fascinating. But basically, one of the kill shots the Romans would do would be like right here in the opening between your sternum and the tendons for your sternocleidomastoid, which is this big rope-like muscle that goes from your sternum up to the mastoid process of your skull. So this right here would be like the kill shot. The idea being, if a gladiator was mortally wounded and they're just like, end it, then they'd expose their neck, and then the victor would take the sword and just basically shove it down the center of the thoracic cavity, entering through this area here. Of course, you would pretty much almost instantaneously kill the person, because it's basically going right down the mediastinum and straight to their heart is what it's doing. So that was one of the Roman techniques that they used to do. But this is kind of like you have a top side and a bottom side, or a side to it. Then you have the intercostal muscles, which are essentially the muscles in between the ribs. You have two sets of them. So you have both external and internal intercostals. And then you have the diaphragm, which is a big bell-like muscle at the bottom of the thoracic cavity. And this actually separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. So the lungs are snuggled into the thoracic wall by way of the pleura. And then you have a space between those two pleural linings, like I mentioned before, your parietal and your visceral pleura with your pleural fluid, which basically provides both lubricant and shock absorption and, of course, functionality. That whole technique, that whole mechanism associated with pulling the lungs and expanding the lungs by not even touching them, but by just creating a suction that sort of pulls them open, is important, because that's exactly how we're going to be able to expand the lungs. First of all, now that we know some of the muscles that are at play, then it's time to start taking a look at some of the physics associated with what's happening during ventilation. First of all, we need to understand that what we're dealing with here is gases, right? And so these are gas laws. Because even though we're taking in a gas, we need to understand that these gases are going to be obedient and subservient to all the basic laws of gases that we learn about in chemistry. They don't get the day off, right? So they don't get to just sort of ignore the laws that govern all the rest of the gases. One of the first laws that we run into in terms of laws of gases, what's called Boyle's law. And that's the dude's name who discovered it. But basically what Boyle's law essentially says is that if you were to keep your temperature constant, the pressure of a gas that's contained in a given volume is inversely proportional to its volume. And so this is basically what it means. If I've got a gas in this small little cube with all those little gas molecules in there, everything else being the same, I didn't change the number of gas molecules in there, I didn't change the temperature at all. If all I did was give it just a bigger cube to live in, same number of molecules, then what Boyle's law says is that the pressure, which is high here in the low volume, is inversely proportional to its volume. So if I increase the volume, I decrease the pressure. That's what that basically means. And so this is important because especially when we take a look at inhalation and exhalation. So this is kind of what it looks like. So this is kind of what it's, the reason why I wanted to do it here, because it's a little simpler here. They get kind of cute here, and a lot of times students are looking at this like, huh, what is this? But imagine that this is your air pressure, right? And so if your container, which is given by the dotted lines here, expands outward, then what's going to happen is your volume is going to go up, which means your pressure goes down. And then as the pressure goes down, what's going to happen is your environment is going to respond to gradients. Now, a couple of things, first of all, always to remember. And I think we learned about this before when we talked a little bit about gradients. We talked a little bit about the respiratory pump and how the respiratory pump moves your venous blood by creating a pressure gradient. And the idea that gradients always move from high to low, right? So what happens is if you crater your pressure inside your lungs, then the atmospheric pressure stays the same. So you don't do anything to that one. And so what happens is it looks like on the outside, the pressure is a lot higher than what's on the inside of you. You're creating negative pressure. And so just like anything else where you create negative pressure, you fill that negative space with something. In this case, what happens is because it's a pressure gradient, you're going to be moving from a high pressure to a low pressure, and then air moves into the container. By the way, this is the exact same thing that you're doing, the exact same set of physics, only it's not with gases that you're doing when you drink through a straw, right? Because what you're doing is you're basically sucking out the atmosphere, the gas that's just above the liquid inside the straw. That creates a lower pressure just above the liquid in the straw, and then this principle takes over. The higher pressure that's in the liquid will flow down its pressure gradient, which is chasing that little negative vacuum you're creating, and it'll basically move up the straw, right? So you're doing the exact same thing. Only in this case, instead of sucking the air out, what you're doing is you're using your diaphragm to pull the air out, to make the volume bigger so that you crater that pressure. Now, if you do the opposite, right? So if you basically move the inside walls and you kind of make them smaller, then what you're doing is you're dropping the volume, and that increases your pressure, because now all of a sudden your pressure looks really high on the inside relative to the outside. Notice nothing changed on the outside, right? It is what it is. But now because you've got a bigger pressure on the inside, then what happens is this looks like it's the smaller pressure now, and that forces your air out of your body. This is what happens when you blow into the straw. You're creating positive pressure, which then forces the gradient in the opposite direction, and that forces the fluid in the straw down until you blow bubbles, right? Which is always fun, because I mean, after all, who hasn't blown bubbles in their milk from time to time? I know we all do it, right? It's fun. Or blowing bubbles in my shamrock shake. That's one of my favorites. It's not easy to do that, but well worth the wait. Especially since I love shamrock shakes. One thing I look forward to every March. But yes, shamrock shake season. I know they're terrible for my health. I might as well just put axle grease in my arteries. But that's my one. Well, actually, I have more sins throughout the year, but more culinary sins throughout the year. But that's one of them. It's one of my grievances. That's just like, let me have my one Shamrock Shake of the year, and then I don't need another one. Okay, so inspiration then basically is important to understand because we got the basic physics of it now, right? So the relationship between volume and pressure, thanks to Boyle's law. And now what we have is basically an inspiration that's set up as what's called an active type of activity. So inspiration is active. What does that mean? That basically means that the diaphragm and the external intercostals, you both have external and internal intercostals, have to contract. This is active. And so because they contract, then what happens is they expand the lungs. So when it's relaxed, the diaphragm has this kind of dome shape to it. Now, when it contracts, basically it pulls down and it creates more of a flatter shape. Now, the contraction of the external intercostals basically will move the rib cage upward and outward, right? And so both of these have the effect of basically not just expanding your lungs, but with the external intercostals, what's going to happen is you're going to be expanding also your rib cage upwards, and you're going to be expanding it outward to make room for your expanding lungs. That way your lungs have room to basically take in as much air as you possibly can. And that's what a lot of your inspiration muscles are for. Now, ultimately, as the volume begins to increase in your thoracic cavity, remember, according to Boyle's law, we have an increasing volume, which is going to be causing what to happen to our, what's going to happen to our pressure if we increase our volume. According to Boyle's law, it should go down, right? So our pressure should go down. And then ultimately, this will create the necessary pressure cavity, if you will, the pressure vacancy that we need. And so as long as it's increasing, the pressure, not the blood pressure, just the pressure in general, air pressure in the lungs and also in the alveoli decreases. Why? Because the entire lung is also increasing by the same mechanism that we saw before. By the same mechanism, the pleural fluid and surface tension. Kind of pulling on that lung tissue and pulling it open. So that's going to decrease the pressure in your alveoli. And so the alveolar pressure is going to be less than the atmospheric pressure, which then allows the air to flow down its pressure gradient into the lungs. So this is basically what it looks like. So you can see here, ultimately, the diaphragm will contract as it goes down. So here you can see it's been flattened out. The rib cage is moving outward and upward. That's creating a negative pressure, if you will, in the lungs, which allows the atmospheric air to move into the lungs and fill the lungs with air. Okay. Now, what about expiration? What about breathing out? So breathing out, unlike inspiration, is a passive process in the sense that instead of the diaphragm contracting, or anybody else contracting for that matter, the diaphragm and the external intercostals are going to be relaxing. So there's no contraction. So in order to exhale, simply do nothing. Okay. So the rib cage will basically go back to its resting position. Why? Because it's the muscles that are holding the rib cage open. So those contracted external intercostals are holding the rib cage open. And of course, the diaphragm is holding the lungs open. As soon as the diaphragm lets go, then there's nothing left to hold those lungs open. And basically they start to get smaller. They start to go back to their original size. Same thing with the ribs. If the external intercostals stop contracting, there's nothing to hold the rib cage open. And so the rib cage starts to go down. Okay, so it's basically a passive process. So as the lungs recoil, the air pressure inside the lungs increases. Why? Because the volume is getting smaller and the air flows out. It's that simple. So what keeps you from collapsing your lung? Surfactant. So your alveoli don't stick together because the surfactant reduces the surface tension and keeps those alveoli from sticking together. So the pleural pressure as well decreases, and this keeps the alveoli open because you kind of maintain a little bit of a constant pressure there just to make sure you keep the alveoli open so they don't actually have enough of a pressure crash to completely deflate. So that's one thing that also happens. So sometimes if you get into an accident, for instance, you can puncture a lung. And so what happens here is that air enters the space in that pleural cavity. And that usually will cause a depressurization of this pressurized system. So the lungs are really finely pressurized for their function. If you compromise the seal, if you will, of this pressurized system, then you'll cause lung dysfunction, which is lung collapse. So this is kind of what it looks like. So here you can see as you start to reduce your volume, your pressure goes up inside the alveoli, which then forces the air out because now it's looking like it's higher inside your lungs than it is outside in the air. Which, by the way, is one of the things and one of the reasons why whenever you take a look at breathing, like at altitude, a lot of people make the misunderstanding that as you get higher in the atmospheric column, the amount of oxygen dissipates, which is not true. We have almost 21% of our atmosphere is oxygen. That's true at sea level as it is here at Mile High, as it is at the top of Everest. So if you look at some of those videos, like if you look at some of those nature programs where they follow the Everest expeditioners as they're kind of going up and they're making their climb up Everest, and you see how they're struggling, right? I mean, they're struggling to breathe. As a matter of fact, by the time you get to that last stopping point, I don't remember what they call it, but that last stopping point just below the peak, where the next part is summiting, right? And so there's lots of different ways to go about this. But if you look at them, I mean, they're completely gassed. They're wiped out. They're like weak and lethargic. And a lot of times they're complaining about they can't get enough oxygen. It's like they can't breathe. And at that point, there's two pathways, right? You can either go up with or without assistance. So you can go up just normal with your normal breathing, or you can choose to have oxygen so that you can get up to the peak. And I know there's two different versions of peaking, and some people have no problem with oxygen. Other people are like, no, I want to go up naturally. But it's significant. You can note, I mean, it's noticeable when you watch those videos. You can see that these people are having a hard time breathing, just doing simple things. I mean, you can hear them. They're just like sitting there doing stuff, and you can actually hear them breathe. I mean, like breathing like they can't get breath. And a lot of times people say it's like, oh, well, Everest is like what, 29,000 feet or something like that. Something like that. It's up there. And people are like, well, there's no oxygen up there. No. There's oxygen up there. There's enough oxygen up there to suit their purposes. The difference is not the oxygen, but the atmosphere. The reason why you have a hard time breathing is not because there's less oxygen, but because the atmosphere differential is different. So as the atmosphere starts to change, the difference between your high gradient and low gradient when you're breathing starts to shallow. So all of a sudden, when you're taking a breath, like just a normal resting breath on the top of Everest, it's not as deep a breath because the difference between atmospheric and your lungs is much smaller. So you're not able to actually get a full breath of air. And that's the problem with altitude. It's not the amount of oxygen, but it's your ability to actually breathe it in because of the pressure changes. And that's the same thing that's true here, right? So it's your ability to breathe it in. that causes people to tire out quickly because they're not able to take, as say, for instance, deep a breath. Like at sea level, you take a very full breath because the difference between your atmospheric and your alveolar pressures are about as big as it can get. And so you get a really good size inhale with lots of oxygen coming in. But at mile high, that all of a sudden changes, right? Because the atmosphere is lower, right? The pressure is lower. And then all of a sudden you're not able to get the same amount. Your alveolar pressure is the same. Why? Because it's governed by your diaphragm. Your diaphragm isn't going to be able to pull harder just because you go higher. It's going to do what it does. And so the closer that atmospheric comes to your alveolar, the smaller the breath is going to be that you take. So that's what's causing the problem, not so much the amount of oxygen. So when you take a look at max, then you can certainly do a lot more than just restful breathing, right? I mean, we all know it's like as we're breathing now, we're just like in, out, in, out. It's very calm. It's what we call tidal breathing. But we can breathe in deeper, right? If I told you guys, take a deep breath, could you do it? Yeah, you can breathe in all the way to the top of your breath. You can go all the way up, right? And I could do the same thing going out, right? So breathe all the way down to the bottom of your breath. You go all the way down so you can't breathe out anymore. So those are some max breathing. So you have room above your normal restful breathing. And you can also breathe in hard, right? For instance, you can do maximum inspiratory effort. So you can really suck it in like a gasp, a deep, deep gulp of air. So for this one, when we're breathing hard, we can deploy a lot more muscles, right? Normally, we're just looking at diaphragm and external intercostals. But once we breathe hard, we can start to deploy and recruit a bunch of other muscles that are also thoracically kind of organized around our thorax. For instance, we can use muscles of the back, chest, and neck to help us to be able to increase the size typically of our thoracic cavity so that we can actually get our lungs expanded even more. Okay. So there's a lot more that we can do. Also, expiration can be forced, right? So I can have you force air out. You can just force it out like that, or we can do it functionally, like when we're singing or yelling or screaming or just blowing air, right? So those are all types of forced exhale. Now, to do that, we also deploy another group of muscles. Remember, normally expiration is passive. That means no contraction. But if you're forcing it out, then you can contract some muscles to kind of give it a bit of a bigger squeeze, right? And so those muscles, the big ones, are going to be the internal intercostals. And so these will basically do the opposite of the external intercostals in the sense that when they contract, instead of opening them up and to the sides and up, they're going to go down and inward. So they're going to basically do the opposite of the external intercostals. You also have abdominal muscles that will help you contract. So if you like really sing out loud, you can feel your abdominal muscles contracting, like you're just pushing on your thoracic cavity, like you're just like a I don't know what you would call that, like a billows, almost like you're just kind of grabbing onto your cavities and just forcing the air out. So you're doing that with your abdominal muscles, and that would basically assist in that exit of all of that air. And of course, if you're screaming or yelling, then that would be an example of a situation. So we have our entire body can be involved in these forced inhales or forced exhales. Okay. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the kinds of volumes we're pulling in. This is what's this is typically what we refer to as spirometry. So it's basically a measure of volumes and rates of breathing. It's what a pulmonologist does. So if you go to a pulmonologist, they're going to basically measure your breathing. And essentially they want to see whether or not you're breathing, efficiently and normally. It's oftentimes the person you go to when you're trying to get diagnosed for asthma. They'll do a breathing test on you, or if you think you have some sort of a pulmonary block, maybe because of cardiomyopathy or something of that nature, they can do these tests to see whether or not you're actually compromised in terms of your ability to breathe. And so the first place they start is kind of with what their baseline is, their normal. It's what we refer to as tidal volume. This is the one I was talking about just a moment ago. This is essentially your normal breath. This is your at rest in and out. So what you're doing right now, just gentle in, gentle out, back and forth, ebb and flow, just like a tidal zone, right? Tide comes in, tide goes out. That's your tidal volume. Okay, that's a normal amount of air that you're just breathing in and out at rest. Then you have a couple of other types of volumes. One is your inspiratory reserve volume, or your IRV. This is the top of your breath. So when I had you breathe in all the way to the top of your breath, what I was having you go to was your inspiratory reserve volume. It's what you've got left beyond your tidal volume. Okay, so you can go all the way up to the top. Your expiratory reserve is the very bottom of your breath. So if I told you to breathe out all the way as far as you could go, that's your expiratory reserve. Okay. So your tidal is right about where you are, where you're comfortable. Your peak, trough. Your peak, your trough. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. If I tell you to take a deep breath as far as you can go, that's inspiratory reserve. If I tell you to exhale as far as you can go to the bottom, that's your expiratory reserve. Now, all of these together is what's called vital capacity. It is essentially the sum of your tidal volume plus your inspiratory reserve plus your expiratory reserve volume. That is your vital capacity, or your VC. This is what you can get to. So here's what vital capacity would be. So if I told you basically to exhale gently all the way to the very bottom, as far as you can go, and then from there, just gently inhale all the way up to the top, beyond your tidal, as far as you can go, inhale all the way up to the very, very tippy top of your breath. That, from the trophiest trough to the peakiest peak, that would be your vital capacity. That's what you have access to. Okay. And so this is kind of what it looks like. So here is your tidal volume right here. So this is your normal ebb and flow. So you see inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. And then if I take you all the way to the top of your breath, keep breathing in as far as you can go. And that's the most you can do. That's your max inspiration. That right there is your inspiratory reserve. Now, if I have you go all the way down, keep going, just slowly, don't force it, just let it go out naturally, and keep on going all the way down, 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 down to about as far as you can go. That bottom part, from your normal tidal down to the very, very bottom of where you can go, that's your expiratory reserve. And in the middle is your tidal volume. All three together is your vital capacity. So in addition to that, so your vital capacity is the sum of all three of those. And so it's important that when you're breathing in your vital capacity, so to speak, right, all those volumes, remember, a lot of your inhaled air never reaches the lungs. Why? Because it's stuck in the trachea, nasal cavities, it's in there, the bronchi or the bronchioles. Remember, those are all those dead spaces. We call those dead air spaces. Because remember, only the alveolar air is important. Why? Because that's where your respiratory membrane is, where you can do gas exchange. You can't do gas exchange anywhere else. So all that oxygen that's in your nasal cavities, guess what? It's not doing anything good. It's only if it gets to the alveoli that it does you some good. Now then, the leftovers. What about the leftovers, right? Because we start off at 0 and we go all the way up to inspiratory, but what about the stuff that's from the bottom of our ERV down to 0? We call that residual volume. This is the stuff that you can't get access to. So it's kind of like a lot of that air is associated with what's in the lungs after you exhale. It's just hanging out there. You can't get rid of all of it. So it's just there. That's residual volume that you can't get access to. Now, all of these taken together, both vital capacity and the stuff you can't get access to, the residual volume, all that taken together is what's called total lung capacity. So what is your lung capable of doing in total? Vital capacity is what do you have access to, right? And then residual capacity is the stuff that you don't have access to. Think of it as sort of like investing your money, right? You have your total lump sum of money, but in reality, you only have like a vital capacity amount of that money, don't you? Why? Because the stuff that you don't have access to, or the stuff that you never get to have, for instance, the stuff you have to use to pay taxes with, that's not yours, right? Or the stuff that you have to use to pay fees for your broker to invest all those funds. So that's all like money that you don't have access to. And so the stuff that you actually have is your gross, that's like your total capacity, minus your costs, in this case, your residual volume, which is equal to your net, right? Which is what you actually have to work with. That's what you can put in the bank. Neat little economics lesson there in the middle of a bio class. So those are important. So that's basically what if you had a breathing test done, that's basically what they'd be testing. So they'd have you hooked up to a contraption that looks a little bit something like this. So you just basically kind of breathe in, the machine records the volume that you're breathing out, the rate that it's breathing out, and the pulmonologist can take a look at that and see whether or not you've got abnormal constriction or blockage or something of that nature. Okay, let's take a look at the control of ventilation. So once we take a look at control, now controlling your ventilation is going to be controlled in a couple of different ways. First of all, you're going to be controlling it with both the nervous system and also with the endocrine system, which is actually chapter 16. So hormones, basically, that's what those chemicals are. You don't just take chemicals to control your respiratory system. It's hormones that will control your respiratory system. And so on the nervous system front, typically here, when you're looking at this, you first of all have to understand that breathing is one of those critical functions, just like your heartbeat, right? That cannot be left to your decision-making tree. You don't get to make decisions about this one, because if you did, then every time you'd make a mistake, you would basically be like a lethal event, right? So this has to be on autopilot. This is one of those ones that we got to set it up on autopilot. It's got to be tried and true, right? It's like putting, paying off a debt and having it doing auto deduct, from your account, so that you don't ever have to be late and incur all those fees. So what we have then in the nervous system and in the brain in particular is a bunch of respiratory nuclei, a couple of control centers that are in the brain, whose job it is to send out these signals to the diaphragm by way of a nerve called the phrenic nerve, and also to the external intercostals, right? Because those are the two that are involved in inspiration. And so these guys will basically tell these two muscle groups to contract. And when they contract, then they will get inspiration. So in order to stop inspiring, if you will, or inhaling, simply this center stops sending nerve signals, and then the two sets of muscles will relax and expiration will occur. So it's literally either you send the message or you don't. If you send it, then you're going to inhale. And if you don't, then you're going to exhale. You're going to relax. Okay. And so that's basically what it looks like. So here's kind of how the hookups look like. It looks like a mess, and it really is a little bit. So a couple of things. First of all, you have expiration and inspiration sorts of things. So the left side is inspiration, the right side is expiration. So first of all, you got respiratory centers in the brain that are sending out messages through motor pathways. And these are going to be going through neurons that will interact with the external intercostals for them to open up, and also through the phrenic nerve to talk to the diaphragm. And so these are going to be associated with inspiration. These are pro-inspiration pathways. Okay. Now then, in addition to that, what happens is as the lungs inflate, you have sensory receptors in the lung tissue and in any kind of expandable or distensible tissue that you have in your body, you have a similar sort of antenna where you have stretch receptors. And so as the tissue stretches, these receptors will sense the amount of stretch. And then what will happen is they will basically communicate that back to the brain to be able to act on that, right? Which will basically cut off the respiratory center and then allow the diaphragm to relax and the lungs to deflate. So basically, it's kind of like the off switch, if you will, on the right-hand side. So this death syndrome oftentimes is a very kind of a discouraging, very frightening sort of a thing that happens to kids typically when they're under a year old. And it's not uncommon for parents, actually, when their kids are still little, to absolutely live life in modern relative amounts of absolute terror because of anything that could happen to their babies, because the babies are just so incredibly vulnerable. And so this is one of those ones where, I mean, you could do everything right. I mean, you could have the baby in there, like in their little like, jumpsuit. So there's not a lot of extraneous stuff around them. So rather than covering them with blankets, which could potentially smother them, you kind of put them like in a nice little warm jumpsuit so they stay warm without having to put a blanket around their face all the time. And you lay them on their little crib. So there's not a lot of extra clutter. There's not a lot of toys in there for them to be able to roll into or things like that. You've got them turned on their side in case they, unless they spit up at night, and you don't want them to asphyxiate from that. So you kind of turn them on their side so that they don't do that. So you do everything right. You do everything right. And then every now and then what'll happen is a sleeping child, they'll just stop breathing. And it's been a huge cause of concern. And like I said, with parents, it's like just absolute terror because, I mean, like there's no way that you can, because we like it. We don't like it really, but we like it when we can like say there's something that maybe went wrong. That's the reason why it happened, right? Like maybe you forgot to do this or you forgot to do that, because then at least it gives us the comfort of saying, well, maybe if I do that instead of neglecting to do that, then my baby will be safe. But the reason why this one creates a lot of terror is that it doesn't really matter what you do. You could do everything absolutely right and still it could hit you. And that's the reason why when they're little, that first year or two, it's just absolute, I mean, just, it's absolute terror sometimes. And so we don't know why it happens, but one thing we do know, however, it's not a vaccination thing. So that's not a thing. It's typically not vomiting, not in general. Because even when a baby spits up, it's really not a huge volume. I mean, it shouldn't be enough to kill the baby. I mean, it may choke them a little bit. You'll hear them coughing at night. That'll wake you up, but it won't kill them quietly and silently at night. That's literally what happens. It's almost like they're just resting peacefully, just quiet. I mean, just perfect and peaceful. And then they just stop breathing. And it just freaks parents out. Infections, this typically doesn't happen to babies. It happens to healthy babies that have absolutely no issue. Oftentimes what we think it might be is basically the brain, the respiratory center in the brain is still developing, and it creates a little bit of a hiccup in there that just kind of disconnects. There's something in there that disconnects, and basically the lungs forget to breathe, essentially. And it's something that makes a lot of sense, right? Because in that early period, like right after birth, one of the things that the baby is doing is the nervous system is under heavy amounts of development. There's a lot of development that's going on in the baby. One of the main systems that's developing in those first 5 or 6 years is the nervous system. And literally when a baby is born, a lot of people don't really kind of understand what a baby is and isn't capable of. Babies are basically like a little bundle of reflexes when they're first born. And they have to grow and develop that ability to start laying down some of those more cognitive types of patterns. And that's kind of where all their learning comes from. One of the first things they learn which they don't have coming out, is they have to learn just basic recognition. I mean, one of the very first lessons that a baby learns is, who's my mama? That's one of the very first things. You know, who's my dad? Who's my family? Right? And so it takes a little bit of time, because if you notice during the trajectory of the development of a baby, they don't start off knowing who you are. Half of the time when they're little like that, they don't even know if you've entered the room or not. Right? It takes a few months before they get to the point where they can start to they can identify you. They're starting to like, oh, there's mom's voice. I know she's in the room. And so they get to that point where you can, for the first time, you can see them actually kind of like looking at you and actually making eye contact. And then when you walk away, you can kind of see them sort of try to follow you as you're walking away. Or if they hear you, you can hear them trying to track you throughout the room. Like if I'm talking and they're laying on the little changing table, I can, you know, they kind of turn their little head because they can hear me over there on the other side of the room. Those, by the way, which is actually important. And so this is kind of one of those reflex sorts of things that that you notice. Like if you take a look at a baby, you kind of put a little toy in front of their face. It helps to stimulate their ability to identify and to lock on, to like see things and to make things out and to lock onto them and to be able to kind of follow them around. You can sort of do that with like a little toy. You can kind of move it around and see how long it takes them to sort of follow that little toy from left to right. So like with us, if I say follow my finger, you can follow my finger pretty much spot on, right? Wherever I move my finger, you're like right there. But with a baby, when they're first learning it, there's a bit of a delay. You'll move your finger to the right and they'll kind of like there'll be like a couple of seconds worth of delay before they actually follow it. They know where it went, but it takes a little bit for them to follow it. Those two regions, auditory and visual tracking, is a part of the brain called the inferior and superior colliculus. And that part is developing. That allows us to be able to visually track and auditorily track around the room. So the brain is developing, which makes a lot of sense. If there is a development disconnect between the respiratory centers and the lungs through the phrenic nerve, then literally it could just forget to tell the lungs to breathe. And that would cause SIDS. Okay, so some of the other controls. So the respiratory center, when you're taking a look at it, will control both the rate of respiration and the depth of the breath as well. So how often are you going to take a breath and how deep are you going to take a breath? So this is all controlled automatically so that you can essentially adapt this to whatever happens in your body. However, this is all the involuntary stuff, right? So you can also exert voluntary control over this as well, right? So we can, if I told you to breathe quickly, could you do it? Yeah, you could do it, right? If I told you to just breathe very slowly, could you do it? Yeah, sure. If I told you to breathe deep, could you do it? If I told you to breathe shallowly, could you do it? So you have control over this as well, which allows us to basically manipulate our breath for all sorts of stuff. For instance, speaking and singing, swimming, looking at you swimmers, right? And also eating. So you have to stop, kind of put a little bit of a pause in your breathing while you're eating. You don't want to eat and breathe at the same time. That's usually a bad situation, right? So you don't want to do that. And so, of course, you can do a lot of these different voluntary motions that are on top of already that automatic motion as well. You can also nervously control forced breathing. So forced inspiration, for instance. This will cause your stress receptor. So your stress receptor is basically in the walls of your lungs. Will initiate what's called an inhibitory nerve that basically will stop the respiratory center from sending out nerve signals and overstretching the lungs. Right. So basically what will happen is as these stretch receptors start to turn on because you're expanding, they will turn on an inhibitory impulse that will feed back to the respiratory center and cut it short. It's like a short circuit. Okay. And then that will cause people to stop, which will then allow the diaphragm to relax. That keeps your lungs from popping, from overinflating. That's like an overinflation type of a mechanism. It's something called the Herring-Brewer reflex. Okay, it's a natural reflex. It's like an overfill valve, like a natural safety valve. You also have chemical control of breathing. So you also have hormonal, but you also have other chemicals. For instance, you can control your breathing with CO2. So basically the cells are producing CO2 during your cellular respiration. So you're making ATP, generating CO2. It's going to enter into the bloodstream. And so it's going to be adopted into water. So it's going to turn into carbonic acid once it touches water. That's going to break down into hydrogen ions. So basically what happens is your water and your CO2, which is byproduct from your cells, will turn into carbonic acid. And then from here, that will dissociate into hydrogen ion plus bicarb. And these will all be reversible. This is your carbonate buffer system. And so if you have a ton of CO2 coming into your system, then it's going to push the reaction in the right-hand direction, increasing the amount of hydrogen ion you have. And the hydrogen ion is basically what creates pH. It's what creates your acidity. So that's going to cause your pH to become lower, which is acidic. And you have special receptors in your body called chemoreceptors that will sense the actual chemical composition of your body fluids, how much CO2 is in them, how much oxygen is in them, how much what your pH is. So you tend to have two sets of chemoreceptors. Typically, they're sensitive to pH. And so one set is in the medulla oblongata, so it's kind of like the master set. And then you have a couple of peripheral sets. So one set that's in the carotid bodies of your carotid arteries, so it's in your neck as the blood goes up to your head. The other one is in called the aortic bodies in your aorta as the blood goes to the rest of the system. So they're picking up and they're sensing, they're kind of like testing, if you will, the carbon dioxide levels of the blood. And the carbon dioxide levels are directly related to pH. And you don't want, and also oxygen, right? Because they're like two sides at the same point. The more CO2 you're producing typically means the more oxygen you're using, and you're getting deficient in oxygen usually. So ultimately then, when your pH increases, that basically means it's becoming more alkaline. Excuse me. I read increases instead of decreases. More acidic, right? Because pH will go down as it becomes more acidic. Then what happens is the respiratory center, that's the one that's in your medulla oblongata, will essentially change the rate and depth of breathing so that you breathe out your CO2. So here's basically how it works. So essentially, if you want to get rid of CO2, all you have to do is basically push it in this direction, the left-hand direction, and you can essentially breathe this CO2 out. So the idea is, if you stimulate your respiratory system, instead of having that CO2 hang around in your carbonate buffer system, making everything more acidic, if you breathe it out, then you're going to reduce the acidity. It's just not going to be there to create the acid anymore. And so you're going to get rid of that CO2. This will increase your pH back to normal levels, and then your breathing rate will return back to normal. This is one of the common ways to regulate your body pH, your blood pH as well. So if you hold your breath, then what happens is the CO2 starts to accumulate in your blood. It starts to go into your carbonate buffer system, decreasing your pH, making your blood acidic. And then what happens is at some point, you're doing this hopefully voluntarily, right? I'm looking at you swimmers, right? You're holding your breath voluntarily. Why? Because you know that if you start breathing underwater, you're going to die, right? So you're holding your breath voluntarily. And that's going to work for a while. But at some point, what's going to happen is your CO2 levels are going to build up to such a huge amount that it's going to start to stress out the respiratory center in your brain. These chemoreceptors are going to start screaming to the central chemoreceptor, this respiratory center that's in your brain itself. And eventually it's going to override that voluntary inhibition of respiration. And it's going to force you to take a breath. So a lot of times when you think of the mechanism of drowning, it's not like when you take that first gulp. It's not like the person who's drowning has given up. And they're like, well, screw it, I'm toast. I'm just gonna, let's get this over with. Right? That's not what they're doing. They're holding their breath because instinctually, the idea is I want to live and I don't want to die. And I'm going to hold my breath for as long as possible. But what happens is when you move into that drowning phase, the first gulp is reflexive. So as you're holding your breath under the water, then you can start to feel that. I mean, I don't know if you've ever gone swimming and you've ever been under the water, but as you're under the water, you're holding your breath, and then all of a sudden you start to feel this, what I call the gulping mechanism. It's like you kind of feel inside of you like you want to take a breath. And you realize like, okay, no, don't take a breath because I'm going to drown because I'm underwater, right? And so what happens is that's your central chemoreceptor, the respiratory center that's doing that. Because it sees that you've got this buildup in CO2 because you're holding your breath. It's getting to dangerous levels. And then what happens is eventually it's like your nervous system, your central respiratory center says, listen, you know what? I don't know why you're holding your breath, but if you continue to hold your breath, you will die. So at some point, it's like, okay, you know what? I'm taking over now. And that first gulp is reflexive. After that, when you take that first gulp of water in, then you kick in a different reflex, which is the coughing reflex, right? It's what we do every single time water goes down the wrong pipe, right? What do? Yeah, we're coughing it out. So what happens then is once you kick in and move from that first gulp of air, that forced breathing reflex, now you've got water in your respiratory system. That's going to create your cough. That's going to kick off your coughing reflex, which is completely uncontrollable, right? That's going to expel even more air out of your body as you cough out the air because you're trying to cough out the water, but you're actually coughing out the air, which is then going to basically force more water into your respiratory system until eventually you black out. That was probably more than you wanted to know about how that worked. But the reason why I mentioned that is because that's basically how the body is responding to that particular scenario, right? So it's your body that's taking over at that point. It's not because it's like, oh, well, you know, I just lost the will to live. It's not that. It's your body at some point, you just can't control it anymore and your body takes over. And then that first piece is reflexive, followed by another powerful reflex, which is usually quickly kind of it's pretty quick, right? So and then once you take that second gulp, which is after you cough it all out, then probably my guess is you're not conscious for very long after that. And how do you know that? Simple. Anybody ever had head rush? How long does it take for you to start for the world to start going black with head rush? Like a really good, strong head rush. How long is it taking for you? Seconds. right? Maybe seconds for a really good, strong head rush. You know why? That's because the blood's not getting to the brain. And so the same thing would be true here, right? So because there would be water in your lungs, so there's not enough oxygen getting to your brain. So probably after that second gulp, you're probably blacking out pretty quickly after that. Which is problematic, and that's kind of, it makes it hard to fight against drowning because you're blacking out so quickly, right? So, but that's just kind of one of those things. And because I remember there was most movies when they try to capture like somebody drowning, they don't get it right. There was one movie, I think it was like, oh gosh, who was it? It was like some sort of a submarine or a sunken ship movie or something like that. It was like was it Kirk Douglas? It was Kurt Russell, I think. But they were in an air chamber, and he had to dive down in and swim a long ways to get to another chamber to get somebody, or to open up something so that the others could follow him. And he didn't make it. And the image that they showed was actually the first. I mean, I was watching that just like, wow, they got it right. They got exactly what it looked like, because they showed him struggling. You could see, because he was actually really good, because you could see him like kind of forcing down that central gulp mechanism. And then you could see him losing that because he went like that. And then the first thing happened was he blew out a big burst of air, which was cough mechanism coming out. And then shortly after that, he kind of did a quick inhale like that, a lurch backwards, and then he just went out. I mean, it was shocking, actually, because usually, you know, their movies just they're kind of like, you know, they don't get it right at all. They're just, but this one was amazing because it's like, wow, I could actually see where he's actually acting out the different stages of what would happen physiologically. That's, you know, I love swimming, but that's probably one of my biggest fears is drowning. So. Okay, so gas exchange. Let's take a look at gas exchange in the body, right? So basically this is happening in a couple of different places. Obviously you're going to need oxygen, and you're going to need oxygen to be able to produce ATP. It's just a necessary sort of a thing. That's what we need. And once you consume that oxygen, you're going to be generating carbon dioxide as your byproduct. So you got to get that out of your body, right? So you have a couple of things happening here. So ultimately, when you do respiration, you're going to get an exchange of gases, not just in the lungs, but also in the tissues, right? It's happening in two different places. And ultimately, what's driving all of this at this local level, the gas exchange in the lungs or the gas exchange in the tissues, is basically going to be diffusion. And so this is going to be determining whether or not oxygen is going into your blood or out of your blood. This is kind of what it looks like. So here we can see what's called external respiration. So ultimately, you're in the lungs now at this particular point. And so we're going to start off with oxygen. So that's where I want to start off with. So you have a high oxygen level in your alveoli. And as it basically meets your blood, remember, at this particular point, your blood is very oxygen poor because it's already delivered all of its oxygen, right? So what happens is your oxygen follows down its natural pressure gradient and goes right into the red blood cells. And we already learned about hemoglobin, how hemoglobin binds to that oxygen. And so that goes into your red blood cells and fills your red blood cells up with oxygen. And then from there, it's basically going to go back to the left side. It's going to go back to the left side of the heart, and then it's going to go out to the system where it goes into the tissues and the capillaries of the tissues. Now, at this point, what happens is now you have your oxygen levels are very high in the red blood cells and very low in the tissues. Why? Because the tissues are burning the oxygen. So they're using it up. So in this case, your oxygen will move from the blood into the tissues where they're needed, where the tissues will go through internal respiration, that is cellular respiration, what's happening in the mitochondria. They're making ATP and energy to do their business, their cellular business. And then the CO2 will start to develop and basically accumulate in trash. So your CO2 levels are very high at this point in the tissue cells, and it's very low for the most part in the blood. So what happens is the CO2 naturally moves by diffusion into the blood, where it's basically stored in this carbonate buffer system. That's basically what this big old thing right here is basically that big old carbonate buffer system that I drew a few slides ago. Okay. Now then, it's going to be then moved through the venous system. And it's going to go up into the right side of the heart and then into the pulmonary system, back to the lungs, where you're going to see your red blood cells are going to be high in, or your blood rather, is going to be high in carbon dioxide, whereas your atmosphere or the air inside your alveoli is going to be low in carbon dioxide. So it's basically going to flow naturally out into the alveolar airspace. And then you just exhale it, right? And you do it all again. So basically, at the same time that your red blood cells are getting rid of CO2, they're also picking up oxygen. So they're picking up and delivering at the same time. So this is a good place to start. That kind of gives you a little bit of the lay of the land. And this will be kind of a good place to start our next round, which will not be Wednesday, it'll be next Monday.